Did you know? Well, let's talk about it in this episode of Whiskies. Jasper Newton, better known as Jack Daniels, was born in 1849. Now, his mother passed away shortly after he was born, and so he was raised by his father and his stepmother. And him and his stepmother could not get along. It got to the point to where Jack Daniels left the home at the age of 15. Now, shortly after that, his father had passed away in the Civil War. Now, Jack Daniels, he was homeless, and so there was a man by the name of Dan Call that took Jack Daniels under his wing and brought him onto his farm. Now, Dan Call was a pastor, he was a farmer, he also was a moonshiner. And so Jack Daniels worked on Dan Call's farm for some time. Now, Jack Daniels got curious because he seen all from a distance, he often seen smoke, and he would often want to know what was going on in the mountains. And so, of course, eventually he inquired and he asked, and then eventually Dan Call allowed Jack Daniels to work on his moonshining or his distillery at the time. Now, Dan Call, oftentimes in history, it's taught that Dan Call taught Jack Daniels how to distill whiskey. But that's not necessarily all the case. In fact, there was a man by the name of Nathan Nearest Green who taught Jack Daniels how to distill whiskey. Now, Nathan Nearest Green, which some affectionately call Uncle Nearest, was a slave who was a master distiller at Dan Call's distillery. And Nathan Green, the beautiful thing about Nathan Green is he brought a lot of his heritage from Africa. So the whole Lincoln County process actually came from Africa, to where they would take charcoal and literally filter the water and the food to clean the food in the water so that they can drink and eat. So that same process was brought over here to America through the slaves. And Nathan Nearest Green taught Dan Call that process when it came to distilling whiskey. Now, fast forward here, you got a young Jack Daniels who was working in Dan Call's distillery, and Nathan Green took Jack Daniels under his wing and he taught him how to become a distiller, a master distiller. Now, that's really the only difference between bourbon and Tennessee whiskey, is the whole Lincoln County process. Other than that, it's pretty much the same. Now, as time went on, Dan Call began to feel the pressure from his congregation, because back then, whiskey was considered the devil's juice. It was considered bad. And here Dan Call didn't consider whiskey bad. He was a pastor. He was a farmer. He was also a moonshiner. And so it got to the point to where his congregation put pressure on him to make a choice. Are you going to be a moonshiner? Are you going to be a whiskey maker? Or are you going to be a people of God? Well, Dan Call, he gave up his whiskey life. In fact, he sold his distillery to none other than Jack Daniels himself. And who do you think Jack Daniels brought with him? He brought Nathan Nearest Green, Uncle Nearest, to help him distill that fine whiskey. Now, as time went on, Nathan Nearest retired and his sons went on to help Jack Daniels form their new distillery. And in that new distillery, Jack Daniels, one day he got very upset because he couldn't open his safe. And so he kicked the safe, he broke his foot. And of course, his foot had infection. And then eventually he had to get his foot amputated. But that infection kept growing, that gangrene set in, and eventually claimed his life 5 years later. And so Jack Daniels didn't have any kids. And so his I think it's his cousins or his nephews took over the distillery. And then they eventually got through the Prohibition. And then in 1950, Brown-Forman purchased the Jack Daniels distillery. And it's because of Brown-Forman we know who Jack Daniels is to this day. Jack Daniels was word of mouth back then. But when Brown-Forman took it, they globalized it. In fact, you had a lot of celebrities that took on the name, and one of the most famous people at that time who really made Jack Daniels famous was none other than Frank Sinatra. Now, Frank Sinatra was synonymous with Jack Daniels, the whiskey. In fact, he often called it God's nectar or something like that. And even when he was buried, he asked his daughter to put a bottle of Jack Daniels in his casket. That's how much he loved Jack Daniels. Now, let us go ahead and crack open this Jack Daniels here. This is Jack Daniels. I'll read a little bit about this on this label. This is number 7. This is the original Jack Daniels whiskey. It's a Tennessee sour mash distilled and bottled in Jack Daniels Distillery in Lynchburg, Tennessee. It's only 80 proof, and it's 80% corn, 12% malted barley, and then 8% rye. And so let's go ahead and crack it open. Let's see what tasting notes we can get from the original Jack. Let's see what we can get from Jack Daniels. Of course, you see that it's a very light color. It's like an amber. Very sweet on the nose. Instantly, you smell that banana. Maybe some maple. It's got some vanilla notes coming through there. So it's actually not a bad nose at all. And I've never had Jack Daniels neat. I've only had Jack Daniels with Coke. I'm gonna tell you a quick story real fast. Now, when me and my wife was dating, we used to go to this spot on the east side of Detroit. It was a pool hall. Now, normally back then, I didn't really drink whiskey by itself. I used to drink cocktails like amaretto sours and Long Islands. But this night, it was no way I'm drinking a girly drink. So this night was thick. It was a bunch of dudes walking around. They looked tough. There were some tough guys, right? So what I look like getting an amaretto sour with an umbrella in it? It just ain't happening. So I decided, give me a Jack and a Coke. And I'm walking around with my Jack and a Coke. And my wife was like, where's your amaretto sour? I pulled her aside and I said, if you don't be quiet, you gonna get us killed. Ain't no way in the world I'm walking around an amaretto sour in this pool hall. That's my story about Jack and Coke. That's how I was introduced to Jack and Coke at that pool hall on the east side of Detroit. All right, so anyway, let's go to our tasting notes. Yes, it falls off really fast, so we'll say that. But you do get that banana note. There's a little maple in there. I do taste a little cinnamon on the mid palate. There's pretty much no finish. It dissipates on the first sip. Let's go in for the second sip. Yeah, it's good. I mean, it's Jack, right? This is your traditional whiskey, your traditional bourbon, can I call it? No, Tennessee whiskey. This is your traditional Tennessee whiskey. You do get that maple in there. You get a little sweetness on the tip. It is a little drying in the back. As the finish in that second sip is there. It's not as strong, but you do feel it a little bit in your esophagus as it rests down here. It's pretty good. I enjoy Jack with Coke. It makes a very good cocktail. It's the most famous cocktail probably in all whiskey, and it's good. And I love the history of it. I love the fact that here Jack Daniels, and maybe this is something you didn't know, even to this day, they have employed Nathan Nearest family, even to this day. There's some Green members that work at the distillery, even to this day. So you're talking about somebody looking out for someone from way back in the day. Jack Daniels and Nathan Nearest were inseparable, and they no doubt made history together. So Nathan Nearest and Jack Daniels, two good friends, Uncle Nearest and Jack. And we're going to review Nathan on another day. We got another bottle of Nathan that we'll review. And we just wanted to do a review of the Jack Daniels and give my tasting notes on it. So thank you guys for joining another episode of Whiskey Eats. And like we always say, please always drink moderately and responsibly. Have a good day. It's not bad at all.